Hi guys, it's Stuart from Mr. T's Primary History here with another home learning pack. This is for a very significant anniversary which is coming up quite soon, and that's the 75th anniversary of VE Day. So, what are we going to be doing in this lesson? First, we'll look at what is VE Day. Then we'll spend some time looking at when did it happen. As part of that, we need to have a think about an overview of the causes of the war, and then some significant events on the Western Front with a real focus on Britain. What happened on the day, and why should we remember it, is what we'll do to finish the lesson. So, let's get started then. What is VE Day? It means Victory in Europe Day. It was the end of the Second World War in Europe, but it is important to remember that the war carried on for several months in the Pacific. The war had lasted for 6 years, and people in lots of countries around the world had been affected by it. It was marked with celebrations, street parties, but also some sadness. When did it happen in history? Now, in history, it's important that we look at it as part of the wider story of history, and we're going to focus on British history, but you will also learn world history, which is really important too. In Key Stage 2, the earliest piece of British history we look at is the Stone Age to Iron Age. That's prehistory. You'll notice that the bar goes all the way to the edge of the screen. It would go far further than that, but I don't have space on my monitor because otherwise the scale would be enormous. The arrow on the end of the BC section of our timeline is really important because it's a reminder that history keeps going beyond what I can show into the past. Millions and millions of years. The Iron Age came to an end when the Romans invaded. You'll notice there's a crossover. The reason there's a crossover is because in 55 BC, Julius Caesar tried to invade but was unsuccessful. Augustus arrived in 44 AD and was successful in conquering Britain. It ends at about 410 AD when the Roman legions left. It's really important to remember that the legions left, that's the soldiers, but the people in Britain at that time could very easily be described as Roman, having been under Roman rule for several hundred years. There's an interval between the end of the Roman period and the beginning of the Anglo-Saxon period. I wonder why that is. You'll also notice the duration of it is slightly longer than the Roman period, but nowhere near as long as the prehistory Stone Age to Iron Age. In 789 AD, we had the Viking raids really beginning at Lindisfarne, and then there was a conflict between the Vikings and Saxons to take control and rule Britain. They both end at the same time, the year 1066, when we had the Norman invasion by William the Conqueror. That's where we normally stop looking at British history in primary schools. You might have looked at them some more, but that's where we normally stop, so that's where I'm going to stop telling you about that now. 2 more events I need to really tell you about just before we get started. That's the First World War, which, as you can see, is a tiny duration by comparison to the others. And if I could make the line any thinner, but you still be able to see it, I would have done, because it is only 4 years for the actual war. And then the Second World War. Really tiny duration, but both really crucial in terms of our understanding, and we are going to be focusing on them today. What do you notice about the duration of the periods of history you can see here? Pause the video, have a think, have a discussion about the duration, the amount of time that the periods lasted for, they ran for. If you picked up on the fact that they're all different, that's correct. The longest being the Stone Age to Iron Age. You might have picked up on the overlap. It is possible and very common that we see multiple timelines existing at once, and we call that concurrence. Which of these periods of history stands out to you and why? That could be for any reason. There's no right answer to that one, it's a really personal one. Try and make it related to the history though. For me, I would say that it's the Roman Britain, because I live quite close to York, and that was a really significant settlement in Roman Britain, but it was also very significant for the Vikings as well. Let's change the scale on our timeline and look at our more modern history for the First and Second World War in more detail. So, you can see our second timeline here. The focus now is on what caused the war. The scale of this timeline has changed. On the last page, it was 500 years per increment. Now it is much smaller. It's 5 years. The blue bar underneath our timeline scale represents the First World War, which ran from 1914 to 1918. The purple bar represents the Second World War, which began in 1939 and ran until 1945. The overall question that we need to be thinking about for this part is, do you think these are all of the events that caused the war? So I'm going to show you some events that are related to the war, and what I'd like you to do is just as we go through them, I want you to think, are these all of the events that caused the war, or just some of them? So, let's start. The first arrow represents November the 11th, 1918, which, as I'm sure you know, marks the armistice, which was the end of the First World War. June 28th, 1919. Germany and the Allied powers signed the Treaty of Versailles after 6 months of negotiations. There were lots of different ideas of how peace should be arranged for after the First World War. Should the Germans be punished and forced to pay for all the damage that had been caused? Or should peace just be there to create peace and avoid another war? France was very keen for the former because their country had been damaged. America and their President Woodrow Wilson had a 14-point plan for peace. The Germans were forced to pay large reparations for the war damages. I wonder if history would have been different had a different treaty been signed. We will never know. One of the consequences of the First World War and the Treaty of Versailles is setting up of what we called the League of Nations. It's a little bit like the UN today. But, sadly, it didn't really have any powers to force anything. I wonder if that meant it didn't work as well. Pause the video here and have a think about this question. Given that Germany has been punished and blamed for the First World War, if you were one of the German people, how would you feel about it? Pause the video here and have a bit of a discussion with somebody that you're with. If you're not with anyone, jot down some ideas. So, let's have a think about the consequences of Versailles. First, the fact that Germany would have to pay an enormous amount of money would damage the German economy, meaning that it wouldn't be able to run as well. They wouldn't be as strong, which would mean people would be poorer, which would make them feel quite angry. Also, I don't think it's fair to say that the Germans were to blame for the First World War. It's very complex political history that you tend to learn about in high school. But for us, it's very safe to say that the Germans weren't happy. Here's the next event. That doesn't mean that nothing happened between 1920 and 1929. What it means is we're just not going to focus on those, but a bit of a guide. There was a rise of extremism across Europe. That's people that have very extreme views that we wouldn't like today. We have fascism and we've got communism. They're two very different ways of trying to run a country. This includes Adolf Hitler in Germany and Joseph Stalin in the Soviet Union, which is now Russia. That event there is the Great Depression, and it begins with the Wall Street crash. That's where a lot of money was lost on the stock exchange, where businesses have stocks bought and sold. The consequences of that were that businesses were not able to trade as much, that people became poorer, and they didn't have as much money. That is definitely not a good thing. I wonder what the consequences of that would be for the different countries. Remember, Germany is already struggling because they're having to pay lots of money in reparations. The American businesses, the French businesses, the British businesses would be struggling at this point because people have less money. That's when we tend to get extreme opinions and extreme political parties starting to rise. It's happened through history. Here's the next event, and then I'll tell you what happens in the interval between them. The Nazi Party, which is the one that Adolf Hitler came to lead, became the second largest party in the German parliament, which is called the Reichstag. And Germany begins to go against the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. Hitler loses the presidential elections in 1932, but he becomes Chancellor, which is a bit like our Prime Minister, in 1933. Then, he begins to take more of a dictator role. Next stop, August 2nd, 1934. The German president sadly dies, and Adolf Hitler makes himself Führer of Germany. He becomes the head of state, as well as the Chancellor. That means he has undisputed power. So he's become more powerful. Next one, 1935, January 7th. The League of Nations approves the plan for the Saar plebiscite, which means that part of the land Germany had lost at the end of the First World War is returned to them. Now, I don't know, but if Germany start to get their land back that they lost, they're going to become more confident that they can do this again. I wonder why people did that. Why Britain and France did that. We'll have a talk about that in a while. 1936. Germany breaks the Treaty of Versailles again and seizes the Rhineland, which is part of the land that they lost at the end of the First World War. 1938. Austria is annexed by Germany. That means military force to take control of a country. So they've gained more and more land. Doesn't it seem strange that Britain and France don't do anything about it? September the 30th, 1938. The Munich Agreement is signed by Germany, France, the United Kingdom and Italy. It allows Germany to take control over the Sudetenland, more land they lost at the end of the First World War, in exchange for peace. This was part of a programme called appeasement. Now, appeasement is where you try and avoid war by giving somebody what they want. The UK Prime Minister was a man called Neville Chamberlain, and he came back from this meeting with a letter saying it meant peace for our time. I think we know he was wrong on that. Moving on to the next year. 1939. There are quite a lot of events to go through for this one. Germany occupies and annexes Bohemia and Moravia Silesia in violation of the Munich Agreement. So the agreement saying you can have this land but don't have any more has just been broken. Hungary, another country, annexes Carpatho-Ukraine. Hungary and Germany were allies at this point. The end of March, the United Kingdom and France offer a guarantee of Polish independence. What that means is they will defend that country if they're attacked. August 30th. There is a German ultimatum, that's a message to Poland. September 1st, Germany invades Poland, and this is the start of the Second World War. Pause the video here and have a quick think about why would Britain make these choices? Why wouldn't they stand up to Adolf Hitler when he's going against the Treaty of Versailles and against the Munich Agreement which he signed? Pause the video here, have a discussion or jot your ideas down and then we'll have a chat. So, to understand this, we have to go back to the First World War. Remember the devastation it caused, the people that died, the country struggled. Nobody wanted another world war. People actively wanted to avoid it. So they used appeasement to try and avoid another war. Sadly, it didn't work. But now that you understand the logic, does it make a little bit more sense to you? Let's think back to that question I posed to you at the start. Do you think these are all of the events that caused the war? The answer is definitely no. It's just some key ones that I'm choosing to make sure that we know. Last timeline to have a look at. You'll notice it has changed again. This represents the war itself. It begins in 1939 and it goes on past 1945 into 1946. The key aspect for this is, can you link any of the events in the war? Did one cause another to happen? Let's make a start then. The bar I've just added on is the duration of the war itself. Now let's have a look at some of the key events. If it's an arrow, it's a single event. If it's represented by a bar, it has a duration of time and it runs for longer. The Battle of the Atlantic. Now the Battle of the Atlantic was fought between the British Royal Navy and the German Navy, mainly the U-boats, submarines. Britain needed to get food and equipment imported, so that means brought over by boat, quite often from America. The German U-boat was sinking that, the consequences of which were less food. Now let's have a look at the next event. UK rationing. Rationing is where the amount of food is limited. People get coupons, a bit like vouchers, which say how much food they can get. Can you see how the Battle of the Atlantic and the reduced amount of food and equipment coming in would mean people couldn't have as much food? That's what we call cause and consequence. The cause of rationing was the Battle of the Atlantic. The consequence were that people didn't have access to as much food. It's a really interesting thing to have a look at. Feel free to research that yourselves. Have a look at some more events then. That blue bar there represents a very significant event called the Battle of Britain. The Battle of Britain was where the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, tried to take control of the skies over Britain by sending over large fleets of aircraft, and the British Air Force were trying to stop them. This was crucial. If the British Air Force couldn't hold off the Luftwaffe, Adolf Hitler had made plans to invade. Luckily, the Air Force from Britain were able to win. We then look at what's called the Blitz. You see how they overlap? The Blitz was a campaign of bombing against British cities, especially those with lots of industrial factories. This is a very significant event. This is where Adolf Hitler tried desperately to destroy the British cities to make Britain surrender. It was not successful. I've added on an arrow there for D-Day. D-Day was the time in which the Allied powers, in this case it was Britain, Canada, USA, where they invaded Northern Europe, which was under Nazi control, to start reclaiming it and try and win the war. Today our focus is going to be on VE Day, which marked the end of the war in Europe. Don't forget, it did continue until late that year in the Pacific, marked by that arrow there. VJ Day, that's victory over Japan. And you see how the events link together. Do you remember what that's called? It's an idea called cause and consequence. So, now that we've got that chronological overview, which we really need for history, let's start having a look at our inquiry to complete. So, our inquiry question then. How is VE Day remembered by those that were there? The three key elements we're going to be looking at. We're going to be looking through some sources of evidence. Now, these are primary sources. Questioning is absolutely vital for history. There are questions to answer, and feel free to think of your own that you can look into more detail afterwards. And then we'll be writing ourselves a conclusion, because if we're having an inquiry question, we do need to answer it. What happened on the day? We're going to look at sources of evidence to find out what happened on the day. I've got a photograph for you to look at, and I've got two people's experiences. You'll need a piece of paper, pen or a pencil, something like that, and if you have the worksheet that I've created, then the table that you can see on the screen now is one to have a look at. If not, don't panic, just write the word similarity and different, or you can make yourself a table. If you need to do that, pause the video here and do that now. Okay, let's get started. Here is a photo of a street party. This photo was taken in the East End of London and it was taken on VE Day. What I want you to do is I want you to pause the video here. I want you to look at it and I want you to think about all of those things that jump out at you. You can't write down similarities and differences until you've seen all of the sources, but what you can do is you can make yourself some notes of things that you can see. Pause the video, do that now, and then I'll point some things out to you. So, I'm going to show you a couple of things that drew my eye using some boxes. The yellow boxes appeared on the screen. There are 3 children at the front here. They all seem to have a similar kind of hat on. I wonder if that was fashionable or specifically for this celebration. The boy on the left, as I look at it, he's wearing braces. We don't tend to wear those now. They work similar as belts that we wear. We've got a baby next to the boy. They all look like they're dressed relatively smartly. Let's have a look at another person in the picture to see if that tells us anything else. The orange box has appeared. There's a lady here. She's got the same kind of hat on. She's dressed in a dress. And she also has jewellery on her wrist if you look really closely. It seems that this is a very special event for people. And at the back, in that green box, you can see a lot of flags. There only appears to be a couple of men in this picture. I wonder why. Do you recognise the flag? It's the Union Jack. So that's the flag of the United Kingdom. If you want to pause and make yourself some notes or look at anything in more detail, please feel free. After the video lesson, there are hundreds of photos of VE Day. I wonder if you can find any from your locality, where you live. The key aspect is I wonder if everyone's experience was the same. Now, my grandma and granddad were alive during the war and they both remember VE Day. First, I'll show you what grandma said, then what granddad said. I've given you copies of this for you to look at as much as you want to, so please feel free to refer to those after the video lesson or you can read along as we go. As you listen, try and find any similarities and differences from the photo to what grandma says. Pause the video whenever you need to. Let's have a look then. So this is my grandma's memory of VE Day. To us as a family, we had no one really involved in the war apart from a cousin in the Air Force who was in Britain still. From nowhere, Union Jack flags appeared and were everywhere. I remember my dad took us around Selby with my sister to make sure we remembered what the day was like because we hadn't seen anything like it before. Selby is where they lived. It's a town in Yorkshire. No one seemed to know where they all came from. We managed to buy a little one, she means flag, to wave, and my dad was mortified, that means embarrassed or ashamed, because it was made in Japan. We tied it on our bikes. I wonder why they were ashamed that it was made in Japan. Any ideas? If you said because Britain was still at war with the Japanese in the Pacific, spot on. Feel free to pause the video at the end of each paragraph if you like, or you can just re-listen to it afterwards. For the party, everyone on the street had to give up coupons. That's vouchers used for rations, and 2 shillings to help pay for it. Also, everyone gave 2 teaspoons of tea and 2 teaspoons of sugar too, so that everyone could have tea to drink. When the party was about to start, everyone had to take out a chair and sheet to make a tablecloth. A poor family didn't have any, but neighbours brought out spares for them. They also let them join in, even though they couldn't afford to pay the 2 shillings people had contributed, because everyone was rallying together. There was a piano, singing, dancing, and an accordion. That's a type of musical instrument. People that could bake made buns. There were sandwiches with either fish or meat paste in them, as there still wasn't much food about. Do you remember on our timeline? Rationing continued far beyond the end of the war. It was the first real jollity. That's a cheerful celebration we grew up with because I was a toddler when the war started. There were never really any celebrations because of the blackout conditions, and that's related to the Blitz. Interesting that we can find some similarities there, just to give you one to get you started. Both mention flags, don't they? Wonder what else you can find. Let's have a look at Grandad's memory. I wonder how different that is, and what similarities there are. So this is my granddad's memory of VE Day. I had a couple of uncles who were killed in the war, so there were sad memories because they never came back. I never saw them again. Uncle Tommy was married to Aunt Doris. When he came back on leave, he demonstrated how they fixed bayonets onto the rifle, and he charged and put it through the door. That means left a hole in the door. The family smiled when they reminded each other of this story. The family missed him because he wasn't there. There were celebrations about the war ending tinged, that means a small amount of something, with a certain sadness. I remember my mother made some bunting as she was a dressmaker and was good with a sewing machine. They were red, blue and white. Any ideas why those colours? It's the colours of the Union Jack, isn't it? Rectangles of paper sewn onto a string. She did lots of them. I think she collected material and held on to it and kept it for all sorts of reasons. We found loads when she died. I wonder if people still do that today, or whether that's more something that doesn't get done as much. There was dancing going on in the street, but I didn't understand it, as I was a little lad. Some sort of music was playing, but it wasn't in our street. I didn't understand fully why they were doing it. He was age 9 at this point. It was a radio playing on the street from one of the other houses. The street was 2 rows of houses facing each other, and people were dancing in the middle of it. I don't remember a party or food as such. Isn't it interesting that 2 people's experience of exactly the same event is very different? Pause the video here and see if you can find out those differences, and then we'll have a look at some answers I came up with. If you need to have another look at the photograph, here it is. Pause the video and rewind as much as you want to, and then we'll have a look at those answers. So, here are some answers. Similarities. A street party was mentioned in all of them. Tables and chairs, lots of flags. Bunting, similar to flags. Food. The street mentioned looks the same. There were terraced houses. I wonder if you've got terraced houses near you. The differences. There were fancy clothes mentioned in the photograph, but neither my grandma or granddad mentioned that. A poor family were mentioned in grandma's account, but we couldn't tell that from the others. Doesn't mean it wasn't there, it just means we can't tell. There's no mention of the type of food eaten in the photograph. No music mentioned in the photograph, but it would be hard to see that unless the instrument was in the actual photo. My granddad's experience was definitely less positive because of the personal loss, and it's really important to remember people did feel that way, isn't it? If you've got any different answers, great. Let's finish with our conclusion. Do people remember it being a good day? You can't just write yes or no. Have a think about the evidence we've gathered. Can you say specifically how you know that? I wonder if everyone felt the same about it. We can definitely say that's a no, because one of the written accounts is very different. Do you think it was the same for everyone? I think we know the answer to that is no as well. Don't just write yes or no to these answers. What I want you to do is try and explain it. Use the evidence to help explain and support what you're saying. Pause the video here and write your conclusion. Last section. How should we remember VE Day? It's really important to think that and remind ourselves that lots of people fought and died in the war, and they were very brave, and bravery is a very good characteristic for people to have. People at home had to deal with hard conditions because of the war too. We're very lucky about all of the things that we have in our modern world, and I think it's really worth reminding ourselves how lucky we are. And it was a happy day because the war had ended. But remember, some people were sad because of the soldiers that didn't come home. Those soldiers are marked on memorials. I wonder if you've got one in your village, town or city. If it's safe to do so, go and have a look. So, all done. I hope you found that useful and interesting. I'd love to see any work you've come up with. Have a great day, and I'll see you soon.